you, Scott. Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Assembly's Amateur Hour. At least this portion of it. I'm not really a person who ever gets up in front of people and speaks about Buddhism. Usually, when I'm with other Buddhists, we're just sitting in a circle and being quiet for an hour, which is the only thing I'm really good at. Reverend Sasha and I have had a few philosophical discussions, and she thought it might be useful and interesting for me to offer my perspective on Buddhism, and not from a scholarly perspective, but perhaps from personal experience and what I found useful in it. The Buddha taught something very, very simple. If you want to know about Buddhism, it's really simple. He taught the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering. There is recognition of suffering. There is a means to end suffering, and there is an end to suffering. He once said, "All my life I have only and ever spoken about suffering and the means to end suffering." So my understanding of this came about because I came to an awareness of suffering when I was 12. I heard the phone ring in the middle of the night, which was very unusual in our house. My father answered it, then came into my room and said, "Get up, get your clothes on, you're coming with me." And I had a sense that there was a disaster afoot, but I had no idea what it was, and he wouldn't answer my questions. So we drove out of town, and we came to a hill, and it looked like, this is the middle of the night, it was dark, it was in April, and it looked like there was a giant bonfire on the other side of the hill, and as we crested the hill and I looked down into the valley, I saw my uncle's house. And it was all afire. It was just a blazing inferno. And when we pulled up in front of the house, next to it, I got out and I saw that, there were fire trucks there and a lot of people. And I saw my aunt and uncle, but none of my 5 cousins. And we were a very tight-knit family. They were more like my brothers and sisters than cousins. I saw them 4 or 5 times a week. So we stood there until dawn broke, and then finally they got the flames somewhat subdued, and they went inside and brought them out. And when I saw them, seeing what fire does to people, it shifted me into a place that's so dark and deep I can't begin to describe it. And over time, that darkness only grew. Every time I heard a fire siren, I would fall back into it. And I had incredible anger because I went to Sunday school about a week later, and the Sunday school teacher said, I know you children have heard about the great tragedy in our town, but God watches over children and Jesus takes care of them. And in that moment, Christianity failed me. So I walked out and didn't go back. And over time, it really tormented me, and I became very troubled. And there was trouble in my family and at school. And in time, when I was about 15 or 16, I felt a great need for solitude. So I began spending summers in the forest near our house. We had a hunting camp on several hundred acres of land, and I built teepees out of old army parachutes, and I would stay up there all summer just so I could have quiet. But even then, my mind was restless. And when I was 16, I ran away from home. And soon I was into alcohol and drugs, and I was just a mess. And when I was 20 years old, I read a book on the life of the Buddha. And as I read the description of his state of mind when he left, I realized he was just like me. He suffered. And I think all great religious leaders, many of them do suffer like that. I mean, Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days and didn't eat. There's a perfectly well-adjusted person. Nothing crazy about that. And the Buddha was his day's equivalent of a billionaire. He was heir to a kingdom of wealth, religious privilege and power. And he walked away from it, said, "I can't do this." And he lived in the woods naked for 6 years, slept on the ground in the dirt. There's 22 different kinds of poisonous snakes in India, countless poisonous insects, and he slept there with them. Nothing crazy about that, right? So I read about his life and recognized that he had walked away from his life, and he walked away from everything that he suffered from. And he said that attachment is the root of suffering. And I realized I was deeply attached to so many things in my life I couldn't begin to enumerate them. But I knew it was killing me and I couldn't take any more. So I got a backpack and a sleeping bag and a ground cloth and a book of Buddhist sutras, and I had $40, and I began walking west. I know I had a change of clothes and my toothbrush, a washcloth, the basics. And I just began walking from Pennsylvania, and I didn't know how long I would walk or where I would walk or where it would end, but I was walking west every day. And it was fairly uneventful at first. It was actually quite boring, nothing remarkable. But I quickly became aware that I was deeply attached to talking to people. Now there was nobody, didn't have a cell phone. And so nothing unusual happened until I got to Ohio, and I laid down one night in a beautiful meadow and fell asleep. In the morning, there was something pressed up against me. And I was thinking, what could that possibly be? It was big. I was sleeping on my side, and I looked over very carefully, and all I could see was a big mound of black fur blowing in the wind, and I thought, oh no, a bear. And I was thinking, I hope it's not hungry. And I was terrified. At that moment, a giant head lunged up, and a great big pink tongue began licking my face. It was a great big black German shepherd. And I jumped up and I said, I hope you're happy. You scared the bejeebers out of me. And I asked him his name, and he barked, and it sounded like Ralph. So Ralphie was. So Ralph and I walked to the next town. As I was petting him, I noticed he was gone. He was on the verge of starvation. I guess he was a Buddhist dog, too. And clearly he was. We went to the next town, and I searched. I couldn't find an owner or any notice of loss of said pet. So he went on my journey with me, and he pretty much saved my life in many ways. At one point, we were out in the Midwest, and I fell asleep in a field one night. In the distance, we could see a great lightning storm many, many miles away, but I could see the fingers of lightning coming down. It was beautiful, and we fell asleep to that. And there were a million peepers and crickets all around me, and when you sleep in a field, there's lots of motion. There's like little creatures, mice, and things running around. You can feel it all. And about 1 a.m., I woke up, and he was barking at me and grabbing the sleeping bag and shaking it, and I thought, what is up with this dog? And in between the barking, when it stopped, I suddenly realized it was quiet. There was nothing. And that scared me, because I knew that if all those peepers had cleared out, something was coming. So I jumped up, threw my boots on, and grabbed my bag and stuff and ran for the bank. And as I did, we just got to the bank when a 3-foot wall of water swept through there. It was a flash flood, and he knew it was coming, so he did save my life. Well, we walked together for many months, and finally got to Montana. We're walking down the road one day, and it was incredibly hot, and I was out of water. He was suffering, I was suffering. And a truck suddenly pulled up, and a guy about 30 years of age rolled down his window, and he said, man, I'll bet you guys are thirsty. You need some water? And I said, I need a shower and a swimming pool. And he goes, well, I've got both at my ranch. Hop in. So we went to his ranch with him, and I met his wife and had dinner, and he was an incredibly nice guy. She was very interested in what I was doing and why I was doing it. And Ralph was having a ball outside with the kids. They had a Frisbee, and they would throw it, and he would jump and grab it, and they were laughing and carrying on. And the guy said, 3 months ago, our dog died, and I've been meaning to get another pooch. And in that moment, I realized that this is where he's supposed to be. So it was incredibly difficult for me to let go of him, but I recognized that this is my first lesson in attachment. So I left Ralph there and continued on. Now, walking to there had been the easy part, but once he was gone, it became really difficult because my sense of loneliness really increased vastly. And also, he was a beacon. When I would sit in a little town square or a town park, young people come up to me and, oh, wow, you got a dog and a pack. Where are you walking to? And I would tell them, and then they'd say, how are you feeding yourself? And I'd say, well, I'm out of money. And they'd say, well, here, let me give you $20 to buy some dog food. So Ralph and I would eat often, off in the mercy of strangers because I had a dog. And once I didn't have a dog, it was just like, oh, look, a bum. And, people would walk around at a distance to make sure they don't have to talk to you, kind of like we do when we see somebody homeless. So I began to get very hungry, and I spent long periods of time without food, sometimes 3 to 5 days at a time. And by the time I got to California, I was really thin and really worn down. I'd spent months walking through the Rockies, and tell you, America's a big place. It takes a long time to get there, and 6 months later. And I'd been in the redwoods, and they're an incredible thing to be in. I mean, I slept at night on the ground, and I swear they were talking to each other. You can hear this low rumbling as they move in the night. It's amazing. And so I came to this little town called Eureka, just a coincidence. And I went into like a little ice cream stand, and I asked them if they could fill my canteen for me. And the guy looked at me, and it was an incredibly hot day. I hadn't eaten in 4 days. I was starving, and I walked in there, and smelling all that ice cream was driving me crazy. But I said, "Could you please fill my canteen?" And the guy says, "Well, are you really thirsty? You feel like you're going to die of thirst?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "Well, good. I hope you do, you stinking hippie." So that wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the tree that fell on the camel. I was crushed by it. And I walked out of town. I found a gas station, filled my canteen up. But there was a little tree off the road, about 10 feet. And I sat down under it. And it was late in the afternoon, and I just couldn't go on. I was broken by the experience, and I was just so exhausted and worn out and tired by it all that I sat there, and I sat there through the night, and every doubt in the world that you can imagine came to me, and I struggled with it. It was like wrestling with the devil all night long. All these thoughts of like, "You fool, you've wasted 6 months, and what have you accomplished?" And all these thoughts were just tormenting me. In the morning, I just sat there, and I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew I couldn't move. And suddenly, a police car came by, and he stopped. And I'd lost my wallet somewhere along the way, so I had no identification, and instantly I knew I was going to jail. Oh no, I'd be put in jail. I'd be put in with these guys who were in there for murder and rape, and I'll be attacked, and I'll have to join a gang to save myself, and I'll get gang tattoos, and I'll come out, and I'll be a criminal, and I'll end up in jail for life, and suddenly his radio came on. And he answered the radio and flipped on the lights, and away he went to whatever emergency had called him. So, whew, saved. Saved by the bell. Well, the next vehicle that came by was a produce truck, and there was a big pothole there. And the produce truck came by and hit the pothole, and everything in the truck bounced. And 3 avocados flew up out of the truck and landed literally at my feet. And I'm looking at them, starving, and I looked and I thought, oh, crap, it had to be avocados. Now, the only avocado I'd ever had were those giant things from Florida that are hard as a rock. They're bitter, they're stringy, they never ripen, and they're just disgusting. So I'm thinking that's what I've got. I'm looking at this, expecting the horror of an avocado, and just cursing my luck. And I see a car coming. It's like, well, it's better than starving. So I picked them up, went back to the tree, and sat down disgusted. And I sat there for the longest time just looking at this thing in my hand, really angry. And finally, I got my Swiss Army knife out, and I cut it in half and looked at it a while longer, and finally put it in my mouth, closed my eyes, just anticipating the horror of this thing. I bite into it, and I was hit by a tidal wave of pleasure. It was astonishingly sweet. And in that moment, can't explain it, but I shifted big time. I stood up, and there was this vast space and quiet, and I was in the midst of it. I looked down at that avocado, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And all the colors of the day were there, and they were just so amazingly powerful and sweet, and the clarity of the sky. And within minutes, a guy pulled up, a young guy, and rolled down his window and said, "Hey, I'm going south. You want to come with me?" And I went, "Sure." Got in. He had tons of food. And it's just so metaphorical, minutes before the cop shows up and gloom and doom, and then this guy shows up and everything is easy. And it was easy after that. There was no more walk. There was just that moment. And I came back to Pennsylvania and started a meditation group and went on from there. And every time I heard a fire siren after that, I would just think, I wonder where they're going. And in that moment, when it all fell away, I cannot describe what happened, but it did. And so now you're thinking, well, this guy probably wants us to walk to California. That's crazy. Walking to Texas will be more than enough. Like the Buddha, I came to the middle path, which is meditation. And meditation is very, very useful. It changes us, and it changes the world around us. There's a Vipassana group that goes into prisons all over the United States, and a warden wrote them a letter once, and he said, I've talked with other wardens, and we can't explain it, but every time you come in to one of our prisons and start this program, only 1% of the population engages in it, but there's an immediate 10% reduction in violence. So we affect the world around us because we are the world around us. When we change what we are and how we see it, when we no longer project gloom and doom, everything changes around us. There's a lot of different kinds of meditation we could do, and I've heard a lot of excuses from people about, I can't meditate, my 3 favorite TV programs are on tonight, I don't have time. Or, I tried meditation once, it didn't work. And that's true. But if we have time to do dishes, we have time to meditate, because doing dishes is meditation. Dogen, the great Zen master from Japan who started the Soto Zen school of Buddhism, went to China to learn from a master because he didn't feel anybody in Japan was qualified enough. And he found a master in China after many months of wandering and visiting monasteries, and the guy assigned him to the kitchen. After 3 months of working in the kitchen, he turned to the head cook and he said, so when am I going to learn this Zen stuff? He goes, well, I've just been cutting onions for 3 months. And the guy turned to him and said, you fool. Clearly you don't understand Zen. And we wonder, if I do this, how will it affect me in my everyday life? Let me give you one quick example of how it affected me. After my divorce, I'm not perfect. After my divorce, I moved to northern Raleigh and into a townhouse, and it was a mixed community, mixed race community. And my kids woke up one morning on a Saturday after we'd been there a little bit, and they said, Dad, can we go outside and ride our bikes with these kids out here? And I said, sure. They were 6 and 8 years old. So they went out. Within a few minutes, my son Alex, the oldest, came back in with his knee all torn up and crying. And I said, what's wrong, Alex? And he said, Dad, they knocked me off my bike. They called me a honky MFer. What does that mean? I'm like, oh boy, what do I do with this? So I went over to the window, and there's 6 little kids zipping around the parking lot, and they're all doing their little sing-song thing, honky MFer, honk it. And so I was angry at first, because, as a parent, your kid gets hurt, and you're like, argh. But I thought, if I go out there in anger, it's just going to push them further on the ground they already stand on, and that's not going to accomplish anything. So I said, well, let's stay inside. And so I meditated on that night for a long time, and nothing came. But I trusted that in meditation that something peaceful would arise. So the next morning we went grocery shopping, and next door was a dollar store, and they like to go in there, buy cheap little toys. So I'm in there, and they're picking their toys out, and I saw a little sheriff's badge and holder, and I thought, Intuitive mind raised its ugly head once more, and I grabbed it and took it home. And that afternoon, the kids were out there on their bikes, and I walked out, and I showed them the badge, and I said, I'm from the Special Police Bicycle Inspection Unit. Have you had your bicycle safety inspections this year? And they looked at me astonished, like, no. I said, well, turn these bikes up. We're going to have one right now. So I looked at them, and they were a mess. The bikes were all badly adjusted. Brakes didn't work. So I said, you wait right here. I'll be back with my tools. So I came out and worked for an hour, set all their bikes straight. And I said, if you ever need any help with your bike again, just knock on my door, and I'll help you out. And they were really thankful. And then I said, would it be okay if my guys came out and rode with you? And they said, sure. So I brought them out and introduced them. They were the best of friends from there on. So it does change us, and it changes our world when we bother to engage in it. And it's spring, lucky us. All the flowers of the world are smiling at us once more. I'd like to leave you with a poem by Anais Nin called Risk. It's about spring. Then came the day when the risk of remaining tight as a bud became greater than the risk of opening and blossoming.